right, so I am about to attach the neckline facings to the dress. So my front neckline looks like this, and then the back neckline facings look like this. The straight edge, the right angles should be the center back, so that's one way of lining it up. So you can see just like that. Perfect. And then the angles that are not right angles are the shoulder seam. So that's how you'll identify them. I'm going to go ahead and put them together and stitch them at a 1/2 inch, since all of our seam allowance is a 1/2 inch for this garment. Whenever you're stitching something, again, we went over it with the side seam. You always want to start at either the highest point of the garment, so that could be the bottom of the armhole to the hem. It could be the crotch to the hem of a pair of pants, or the waist of a skirt to the hem, or the neckline to the shoulder. So I'm stitching and back stitching at the beginning and end of both of these seams. Going to do the same thing with this one. Now that that is stitched, I will press it open at the iron, but I'm first going to attach this neckline to my garment. So what I am going to do first, I'm going to fold in my seams so that the stitch lines are right on top of each other to find the center of the center front facing. Once I've done that, then it is time to line up my right sides together. So I'm going to pin the center front to that center front seam of my garment. And then work my way around. when I pin those shoulder seams, I want to go ahead and preemptively just open them up flat. That's going to help the seam lay flat and flush to the garment. And my facing should wrap around all the way to the seam allowance of the neckline of the dress. And that's where I want to start from. Unzip the neckline if it helps a little bit. So I'm covering up the top of that zipper tape and stitching at a 1/2 inch. There is enough clearance from the zipper at that point. So I'm not hitting the zipper teeth, I'm not running into anything. I am making sure the rest of my garment is clear and out of the way. And I can begin stitching around this slight curve, so I might need to pivot with my needle inserted into the fabric as I go around. And you want to be really careful that you are not puckering the garment underneath, because that'll show up in the neckline. For that center front, if you went ahead and did a turn and stitch seam like I did, just make sure that that seam is completely pressed open and flat so that your seam is not pushed to one direction or the other. That will also help it lay flatter. So my facing is stitched in. So now I'm going to take this to the iron and I am going to press all of my seam allowance towards the facing of the garment. And because this is a curve, I'm going to need to clip some triangles out of that seam allowance, so I can go ahead and do that right now. I'm not clipping past that stitch line. That would destroy my garment and my facing. But every so often, I'm just going to take a little triangle out of like that frontward curve. The back neck is a really gentle curve, so it really just needs more towards the front where that curve is more significant. And again, when I take my garment to the iron, I'm pressing the seam allowance all the way towards the facing, and then I'll press it on that stitch line. Okay, so now I am ready. Okay, so now that my seam allowance is completely ironed towards the facing, I'm going to go ahead and understitch. So going back to our seam sample, I'm going to begin stitching on the side of the facing about 1/8 of an inch away from that seam. So I'm catching all of the seam allowance on the facing side and going completely around the neckline. I'm going to start my understitching at the edge of the zipper tape, so I'm not stitching that zipper tape, and I'll begin stitching and back stitching here. And what the understitching does is it helps to promote the garment to roll down towards the inside of the neckline instead of allowing that facing to pop up and become visible at the exterior of the garment, because that would be really unattractive. The same concept applies to understitching a hem. It promotes the garment to roll towards the body at the hem so that the lining or facing does not pop out and expose itself. And typically a facing is always done in the same fabric as the shell garment, so that way if you do see any of it, it camouflages itself with the exterior and doesn't look like a lining popping through again. Sewing till the end, and I'm going to do the exact same thing on this side. I'm going to stop about a ½ inch away from that zipper tape. Okay, great. So now my facing is almost complete. I have a lot of threads, that's okay. What I am going to do is I'm going to go ahead and do a Hong Kong bias finish, because this edge of the facing is still raw and will continue to fray. So I have some fabric here. Let's see if this is enough. So I have a long length of fabric already cut on the bias, and I'm going to go ahead and just do a Hong Kong bias finish. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to stitch it at a ½ inch along the edge here, and I'm going to fold it up, and I'll end up stitching it on the ditch here. So it'll be raw on the back side, and that's totally fine. It does not need to be finished because this again faces towards the garment. This is 2-inch wide. Because it's not getting finished on the inside, I could really do 1½ inches wide, but 2 inches is just kind of standard. I find it really easy to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and start stitching from the edge and stitching at a ½ inch the entire way. Again, there's a subtle curve on the outside of that facing, so I'm making sure I'm not catching anything underneath. do not need to finish these edges. It's fine. Okay. I'm gonna stitch all the way to the end, back stitch. Because I already did the work of ironing on the double fold, I'm gonna go ahead and just go with it. So I'm gonna clip my bias tape here. And I'm going to allow this piece to fold over the edge here. And I'm going to go ahead, press it, that seam first, and then fold the folded edge over that seam allowance, and I'm going to stitch in the ditch here, and it's going to catch on the back. So I want to make sure that my fold is definitely covering that stitch line, and that's how I'll know that I'm going to catch it from the front when I stitch it. Okay, so my piece is pressed, and now I'm going to go ahead, fold it. I can really feel with my fingers that it is completely covering that initial stitch line. So now I'm going to go ahead and stitch in the ditch, catching the bias tape on the back side. If you miss a spot, it's totally fine. It's not going to go anywhere. You can always go back in and stitch and back stitch over it. I do that plenty. You can always leave it. Again, it's not going anywhere. It's controlled on either side. And this does take a lot of finessing and a lot of practice to really get the hang of and get the feel of. So far it looks like this. It's super clean. I'm really happy with it. We're gonna keep going. Only about halfway through. And notice like how slow I'm going. This is not something that happens quickly. So now my neckline facing is completely finished. What I can do is tuck this inside just at the edge and stitch it down to my zipper tape. And so I can do this by hand or by machine. I think it's going to be easier. Let's see. So I can flip it down. I stitched too far on one side. Flip that corner back up. I'm going to fold it at a right angle to make it really crisp. It should look just like this, and my facing is finished on the inside of my garment. stitched my zipper tape in. Yank that seam allowance out right there. So when it flips back to the right side, it looks just like this. And then I can attach my hook and eyes here, so that neckline is really nice and square now. At the back neckline, ready for hook and eyes. This flips in. So that is my finished neckline of my garment, and the facing looks like this from the inside. So it's completely contained here. All the raw sides are trapped inside, and my neckline facing is done.